Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be able to talk about this book with Michael and to give you a chance to talk to him later about this book, which is really a remarkable book for many reasons, not least the fact that what Michael has sort of slyly done is to write a very good history of World War I that is interwoven with portraits of 6 poets. And I think we all have a sort of idea in our head when we hear the expression, the World War I poets. We think of Rupert Brooke and Wilfred Owen. But Michael's book goes very deeply into the lives of these young men. And as I'll be sort of prodding him about later on through the evening, what he's managed to do is not only give you quite in-depth portraits of these, of course, necessarily young men at the time, but a picture of the war itself, which is really quite gripping, and I have some questions about that. Also a social history, I think, of Edwardian England, late Edwardian England at a certain point. And something else I want to ask about, which is a bit of a cultural history of the literary scene at a given moment in particularly British life before and during the war. So it sounds, I know, like a lot, and yet I don't have to tell this audience that it's all done with great polish, grace, and panache. And one reads it in a state of absolute enthrallment. And I was most impressed by the way, Michael, that you've sort of carried this. So I remember when you said that you were working on this book, and I had no concept at the time of what you were actually up to, and I think it's really an extraordinary book. So there's also something else that, and this is how I want to start, which is Michael, not only because he is interested in these things and he's such a wonderful writer and all the things that we know, but in a certain way he is the only person who could have written this book for a reason which becomes clear in its opening lines, and that's what I want to begin, Michael, by asking you about. You begin by saying that although you were born in the 1930s, in the interwar period, you have, quote, lived all your life in the shadow of the First World War. And so I think a good way to start our conversation would be to ask exactly what you are referring to in that sentence. Why have you lived your life in the shadow of the First World War, which is an event that was over 15 years before you died, and what is the background that goes into that statement?
Well, Daniel, thank you. First of all, 15 years is not that long a time.
No.
If you imagine that you had been born 15 years before the Second World War, that would have,
I was.
So.
But I mean, sorry, what I meant, because you grew up during the Second World War, so the expectation is that's the formative.
Well, yes, of course that's true, but around me, almost everybody that I knew had been in or through the First World War. As I point out in the book, my maternal grandfather, Octavius Musgrove, served in the British Army in the First World War. And never talked about it at all. In fact, you were always warned in his presence not to speak of it, which tells you everything about how he felt. My father served in the Austro-Hungarian army in the infantry, and my uncle Zoltan, his older brother, the middle brother of the three-quarter brothers, was a cavalry officer in the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War, which is most unusual for that army because he was Jewish. And the Austro-Hungarian army did not, as a rule, lend itself to Jewish cavalry officers. And he was wounded and gassed on the Galician front and captured by the Russians and put in a Russian prisoner of war camp. And when the revolution came, they were all released, and he fought his way back to Hungary by joining the Red Army. And so returned to Hungary as part of the Red Army in 1919. And there was almost nobody I knew then who was an adult. It's too loud?
Don't mind me. I'm just going to
Who hadn't lived through and been through the First World War. So that it was a presence hanging over everybody's head. And it was also such a mass of literature to read about. So I began my interest in military things by reading about the First World War and reading First World War memoirs. Luckily, my father had stacks of them. And that's how I became interested in military matters and generalship in general. So the First World War was kind of a looming presence over people, even young people of my age. And almost everybody who'd been through it was in some way scarred and changed by it.
And so what drew you to, so you were essentially haunted at an early age by this?
Partly,
it sounds because of the silences around it.
Yes.
It creates, so I was born 15 years after the end of the Second World War and became interested in it for the same reason,
Yes.
which is that nobody would talk about it. So
Of
in the
course.
mind of a young person, you think, what is the great mystery?
What happened?
But, okay, so that was in the 1930s. What in the late 2000 and teens decided you that you wanted to tackle this subject?
Well, I had always wanted to write about the First World War, but I was never quite sure in what form I should do so, or in what form it would take. Because if there's anything the world does not need, it's another whopping, great, thick history of the First World War. I mean, you could fill
And
this
yet.
room with them, and that's just in the English language. But it wasn't until by chance I began to look through my shelves and found a copy of the Penguin book of First World War poetry, and began to scan through that it occurred to me that the poets were not only important as soldier poets, but also by one of those strange happenstances, which I'm sure you recognize in your own books, that they fit chronologically into the history of the First World War. So once you say to yourself that if I start with Rupert Brooke, I can deal with Britain and Europe before the First World War and the First World War up to Rupert Brooke's death in 1915. And then once I start the next poet, each poet fit into a specific period of the war. It was like fitting in those psychological tests you do when you're given the blocks and you have to fit the round ones in the round holes and the square ones in the square hole. Each of the poets fit into one square hole in the history of the war, and of course ended, as I knew the book would. That was actually the most important moment. I knew even before I began the book that the fact that Wilfred Owen was killed only a week or so before the Germans signed the armistice, and that his mother received the telegram informing her of his death at 11 in the morning on November 11th, 1918, as the bells were ringing all over England to signify that the war was over. And I thought to myself, but that's perfect. First of all, it's so ironic. But secondly, it's the perfect ending to a book I haven't written, because
Right.
at least I know how it's going to end. It's going to end with Wilfred Owen's mother opening the telegram as the bells ring all around her. You know, it gave me, I don't know about you, but it's always difficult for me to think in advance about how I'm going to end a book. But it's a tremendous relief to know before you started how you're going to end it.
Right. That solves one problem.
Yes,
you know.
it does solve
Then
one
there's
problem.
everything else.
Yes.
Right. But it's funny you say that, because in the taxi coming over here, I was telling Stephen about exactly this thing. So the lives of the poets exactly cover
Yes.
the before, beginning, middle, and end of the war. So that's what I meant before, when there's this twining together. So you feel like you're reading these biographies of these 6 absolutely fascinating, and some of them very tragic figures, but you are also absorbing the entire progress of the war. Actually, as you say, with Rupert Brooke, with whom you begin, and we'll talk about that in a minute, the social background for, you know, why these young men were so eager to run off to war. And, you know, I was thinking, and so the first of the poets whom Michael writes about is Rupert Brooke. I was watching Downton Abbey, and there's a scene, and well, this goes, and I'm not really joking, because this goes to why you are the perfect person to write this, because you have this powerful historical link to the event that I don't think anyone does. You know, you were a person who grew up surrounded by people who were part of this event.
Yes.
So in the Downton Abbey episode where World War I begins, and they're all having a tea party out on the lawn, and somebody portentously reads a telegram saying, "We are at war," and everyone somberly glowers and weeps. And that's because they're not you, whoever wrote that. Because I remember as a kid watching Upstairs, Downstairs, and those people were much closer to the event, and they got it right, because people were cheering. They were so excited about the beginning of the war, you know, and I was very struck. Those guys couldn't wait to race off. I mean, we knew what happened, and, you know, the other thing that your book charts is the disintegration of this unbelievably terrible thing. So I want to turn to the poetry, actually. Early on in the book, you make a really interesting statement that World War I was defined by its poetry. And you later go on to say that poetry, more than any other medium at the time, was the chink, and that's the word you use, the chink through which contemporary people were able to glean a sense of what was going on, perhaps even better than from the newspapers, which were heavily censored. So I wanted you maybe to expand on that, because and you talk about the way this then involves, Michael, in a very interesting discussion of the sort of sociology of poetry in the late 19th and early 20th century. So I'd just love for you to talk about that a little bit.
Well, thank you, Daniel. First of all, let me say that poetry has always played a role in defining wars and in making people understand what they were like and what they were about. Because even people who know nothing about the Crimean War can recite the charge of the Light Brigade. And that may be all they know about the Crimean War. And what's more, it's really all they need to know about the Crimean War. It's if you've read The Charge of the Light Brigade, it says it all. Baffling generalship at the top, incompetence in the middle, and incredible bloodshed down at the bottom. That's not actually so uncommon in an age when poetry was important, obviously to those who were literate, in ways which it no longer quite is, and played a much larger role in literature and in life. People look to poetry very often for what was happening and what they should think about it and what they should remember about it. And it's for that reason that in England we have a poet laureate whose job is to write odes on the birth of royal people and their death, and
Poor things.
if possible, to get it as right as possible. So the First World War took place in the last era of that kind of importance for poetry in people's daily lives. That ceased to happen after the First World War. Excuse me. I think because poets like T.S. Eliot were not necessarily less popular, but less open and understandable, and did not have a clear message that you could follow and a clear rhythm that would carry you along.
Sure.
And but when Rupert Brooke was young and was just beginning as a poet, poetry was a hugely important part of literature. It was paid attention to, it was put in the newspapers and magazines. People read it in comparatively large quantities, and it mattered who the up-and-coming poet was and who the poets were who were not up-and-coming but going down. And so the First World War would have been the last war in which poetry actually played a major part. I mean, that's not so completely unfamiliar, as you know better than anyone, because what we know of the Iliad and the Odyssey, we really only know through Homer's poetry. And so in the First World War, it ended 10 years before the Leica was invented. Motion picture cameras were huge, bulky, untransportable objects that had to be placed on a tripod and used very slow film. There were the still cameras of the day were large and boxy, and you looked down into them, with a finder like that. Not exactly the way to capture photographs of combat, because you have to be standing up on your feet and looking down, and it's a perfect way to get shot. So even had there been no censorship, there were not sort of dramatic, there was absolutely no equivalent of the Second World War combat photographer. No equivalent of somebody with a Leica stepping off the beach at Normandy in the first wave taking pictures. So the visual element was lacking, and where it came to exist, it was largely faked.
Yeah, sure.
One of the typical examples of that was that in photographs of Scots Highland regiments that have been of the killed as they approached the German front lines, that the censor, when he allowed a photograph, always made sure that their legs were covered so they wouldn't seem to be in any indecent poses. So no photographs of it and no motion pictures of it that were meaningful. And press reports were, of course, tightly scripted and censored. And yet the young poets managed to express, with the exception of Rupert Brooke and Alan Seeger, the poets after them managed to express the real horror of the war. It couldn't have been better expressed than it was, say, in the poems of Isaac Rosenberg.
Right. So I want to, a good way of getting both into the war poetry and into the phenomenon that you were just discussing about the status of both poetry and poets at this particular and now lost moment in cultural history. I want to talk a little bit about Rupert Brooke. I remember when I was reading The Galleys, I remember we were having dinner or something, and I remarked to you at the time, I was very struck by, there's a sentence that comes early on when you say that for Rupert Brooke to be known, to have come to be known, and I think this is true, as a war poet is both ironic and tragic.
Yes.
And so, and if you could talk a little about both his career, the status that he had, this sort of, he was, you know, as a sort of proto-celebrity before that word even existed, and then what you mean by the fact that for him to be known now as a war poet is both ironic and tragic.
Well, ironic and tragic because, of course, he died in 1915, and not even in combat. But Rupert Brooke was, from about 1911 on, the equivalent of a major rock star. He had the presence, the glamour, the fame. His poetry was widely read and widely admired. And also, he was incredibly prolific. If you start to read Rupert Brooke's poetry, you've got a substantial amount of poetry to read through. He even, largely to escape his mother, took a trip to the South Seas in pursuit of Gauguin, and his poetry about that is, first of all, voluminous, but secondly, quite wonderful and inspired and extraordinary. So the irony of Brooke's life was that he came to be remembered for the 5 war sonnets he wrote in 1915, rather from the huge bulk of his poetry that was written before that. But when you imagine Rupert Brooke, you really do have to imagine the most incredible rock star you can think of in the period from 1910 to 1915. And that's partly because of his physical appearance. He was dramatically handsome, but also part of a part of his charm, his political interests. He was very liberal, very left-wing for the time. He was a Fabian socialist, a member of the first Fabian Socialist Party at Cambridge when he was an undergraduate, which then consisted of 6 members. He was the 7th. So he was an altogether powerful personality, and yet, because of the war poems, we've sort of totally shelved him as a First World War poet, which is really the ultimate blow to his reputation, I think.
And what, I mean, talk a little bit about, because so I have to say that is it making too much of things to say that the fact that you seem to devote more space to Rupert Brooke, there's sort of twice as much about Brooke, I would guess, as about anyone else. And you talk a lot about his charm and allure, and one sort of falls under it as one reads the book. And I was wondering whether you hadn't also. I mean, there's something, you know, partly the allure of the story, you know, it's very Greek, of this godlike youth who's cut down at the absolute prime moment. But I think it'd be helpful to talk a little about his background, you know, what this earlier poetry sort of was, and his background, and what it reflected, and which doesn't seem that different to the war poet. You know, it seems to me on a continuum, which is that he's excited about the war. He thinks it's all very grand. You know, he's the one who runs off and says, wasn't it he who wrote to his friend, "Come and die, we'll have a wonderful time," or something like that? Come and die,
it'll be huge fun.
It'll be huge fun, right. So, but I think, you know, to give a sense of the like, what was the poetry celebrating, and because that's where you start.
Yes.
And the book maps a collapse of an entire world, basically through the poems.
Yes, I think that's true. Let me say just that Brooks' apparent indifference to death, and even his thirst for death and his fascination with death is comes not because he was in any way pessimistic, but because he hated the thought of growing old, and disliked everything he saw about old age, and simply did not wish to go through the whole process of aging, and therefore, if you don't want to do that, inevitably you're going to have to come to terms with an early death. And Brooke was doing that in 1910, 1911, 1912, before the First World War ever happened or he ever dreamed of being a soldier. Having said which, the thing about Brooke that touches me is that I find his personality so endearing and so interesting. And he's the other face of Tom Brown's school days, because Brooke was born in Rugby. His father was a housemaster at Rugby. His formidable mother looked after the boys in her husband's house, and Brooke not only grew up in Rugby, but attended Rugby, and even said that he could not imagine ever in his life duplicating the degree of happiness which he had found in being at Rugby. The number of people who will say that about an English public school is relatively small.
Right. Or any high school.
Or any Scottish school. But Brooke was perfectly sincere and meant it. He did love Rugby, and he did think they were the happiest days of his life. And his poetry, I think, reflects that. Although there are occasional undercurrents of death wish and that run through the poetry like a minor theme, most of Brooks' poetry before the war is lush, but very, very satisfying to read. It's got a real feel to it, and his best poem, I think, is The Old Vicarage, Grantchester, which is a classic English poem and ends with the amazing line, and is there honey still for tea? Because he had this wonderful gift for dropping into all his poetry a line of spoken dialogue or writing that's perfectly ordinary in the middle of the poetry. So of course I found Brooke more than fascinating, and almost everybody, from my beloved wife Maggie to my editor Bob Weil, has pointed out to me one time or another that there's going to be an awful lot more of Rupert Brooke in the book than anybody else. But I'm afraid that's what I wanted. It's like sitting down to eat dinner and you like a special thing and you eat more of it than anything else.
Right. Well, also, I mean, I think it occurred to me, too. So there are two things I want to say, I think. We have the most documentary evidence about him. It's aside from Siegfried Sassoon, I would think. So we just know more about him. But it occurs to me to say, and this is just not just me doing one of my usual plugs for the classics, but he's really an Achilles figure.
Yes.
Right? I mean, that's why he resonates, because he's living a life that has already been lived in myth, and it's a myth that we know about the person who chooses to die young and glorious over living to have an ordinary life into old age. So, I mean, I only permit myself to say this because you mentioned Homer first.
Surely.
But it does occur to me while you're talking that that's why he has a cultural resonance. You know, I'm always fascinated when things happen that plug into these sort of pre-existing myths, and they seem to resonate with a particular ferocity. And I think that's why, because he lives an Achillean life. And it sort
Absolutely.
of proves that the myth is true, that there are these beautiful lightning-like creatures who flit across the stage, and we can't imagine them as being old, as being
No.
anything but gloriously young and dead, actually.
And he couldn't imagine
And
himself
he could do.
as being anything but
Yeah, I was
glorious.
fascinated to read in the part about him that he saw Peter Pan many times.
16 times.
16 times. So, need we say more on that subject? Right. But it is, no, but I mean, it's one of the things that's wonderful about this. There's sort of 3 chapters on him.
Yeah.
But it's also, I mean, to be serious, one of the things that Michael uses, I think, the chapters to do is to give you a picture of England right before the war, the society, the literary culture,
Yes.
the cultural life. And because, so don't buy the Penguin book of war poets. Just read Michael's book, because you get, I thought the excerpts are extremely judiciously sort of salted through the book, and you can see the language becoming rougher and more violent as the outrage about the horror of the war increases.
Yes.
And I was thinking, and it's in the book, and I had a 9th grade teacher who was trying in a poetry, English teacher, who in a poetry class, to get us to understand the power that can be derived from the use of alliteration and assonance, gave us these lines to memorize, which I clearly didn't do because I have to read it, of Wilfred Owen. Only the stuttering rifle's rattled words can patter out your hasty orisons. But there's so much that's really explicit
Yes.
as the war goes on. And so
Yes.
I think the Brooke beginning anchors you in a time and place just long enough to see it all fall apart. So I think it serves a very
I think
important
also,
structural purpose.
again, I think it's also important for the reader to sense that within limits, England before the war, from 1910 to 1914, was at any rate for a middle and upper middle class a wonderful place to live. I mean, obviously lacking in some of the things that make us comfortable now, but nevertheless, one understands Rupert Brooke's fascination with that world as a kind of paradisical world. It was a moment in time when the world seemed at peace, England seemed prosperous. There were no doubts about the English Empire, or very few, and people lived. Those who were sufficiently high on the class scale, dramatically well. I mean, one of the things that I find fascinating is in Rupert Brooke's house is the incredible number of housemaids that his father had as a housemaster at Rugby. There was just no limit to the number of people polishing silver, polishing boots, cooking in what is a relatively not wealthy family. So for a certain class of people, I think England in those years, in those 4 years before the war, was indeed a place you could understand feeling about in terms of a paradisical place to live.
Do you know, there's a very interesting novel by Alan Hollinghurst called The Stranger's Child. I think that's the title. And it's about a Rupert Brooke character who writes a famous poem that is sort of very Brookean. Yeah, very interesting. So Brooke, Sassoon, Owen are the names that we know. I have to say, I'm embarrassed to say, I was not familiar with either Alan Seeger or Isaac Rosenberg, who are 2 of the 6 people that you talk about.
Yes.
And I think people would be very interested to hear about them, because not only because the poetry is very, and in the case of Rosenberg, the painting also
Yes.
is a very fascinating character. But I don't think that people are as aware of them. And I wondered, how much did you know about them, and how did you land on them?
Well, I knew almost nothing about them, frankly. I mean, obviously, all of us know the names and have read one or two of the poems, because you can't go through school and graduate without picking up.
Well, now
these
you
facts.
can.
Now, probably, yes. Well,
I'm embarrassed to
that
say.
in the First World War, we
Yes,
wouldn't know about.
well, right.
But I didn't know much, if anything, about them. On the other hand, I was moved by a separate but important piece of book building, which is that when I began to think about this book, all my poets were junior officers. And some of them, like Robert Graves, rose to the rank of captain, but all of them were basically in their late 20s and served as subalterns or lieutenants in the British Army. And I was very reluctant to do the book without giving the reader a sense of what it was like to serve in the ranks. And so I came to Seeger not knowing much about him, but found him fascinating. First of all, because his roommates at Harvard were T.S. Eliot and Walter Lippmann. And his best friend at Harvard was Jack Reed, 10 Days That Shook the World. So I thought that when I read that, I thought, no, wait a minute. It may be difficult to shoehorn an American into this book, but this one has to be shoehorned in. And I found Seeger absolutely fascinating and second only to Rupert Brooke in kind of steady charm. I liked him enormously. I don't like his poetry as much as I like Brooke's poetry, but you can't change what you like and what you don't like. But I do like Seeger, and it was interesting to me that he joined the French Foreign Legion, which is a patchwork of horrors in itself without even fighting in a war. So I thought, well, that will work. Isaac Rosenberg, I have to confess, I knew almost nothing about, but I thought that was utterly fascinating because he came, he was born in Bristol, but his parents immigrated in flight from Russia because of Russian state-sponsored anti-Semitism. It was the age of the pogrom, the burning down of ghettos. Jews were confined to the Pale of Russia, what is now Western Ukraine, Belarus, and part of Poland, and were forbidden to live in Moscow. And it's fascinating to me that when his father went to Moscow, that the Russian police tracked him down. Then he was released and made his way all the way to Siberia, and they tracked him all the way to Siberia to bring him back, because Jews could not live outside the Pale. And however inefficient the Russian police was, they were very efficient at picking up people who fled from the Pale into Russia, who were Jewish. So I thought this is a fascinating story. And Isaac Rosenberg also delayed joining the army as long as he could, had no sympathy with the war or with the aims of the war, and did not hide any of that. It was very open about it. And I thought, well, fine, at least I've got two people who served in the ranks, because in the British Armed Forces there was, and I dare say there still is, an immense gulf between other ranks and officers, which far from being something that we want to extinguish or diminish, is something we tend to regard as the central supporting theme of the British Armed Services, is there should be an immense gulf between officers and their men. And I found Rosenberg utterly fascinating because he volunteered for this. He could probably have gotten away for a long time without joining up, but he did join up. I suspect because he was so poor that it was the only way he could earn any money at all. And his descriptions of life in the trenches are wonderful because they are not at all, there's no hint in it of glory, of willing sacrifice, of anything except the discomfort, the danger, and the horror of it, and you get it undiminished from him. So those were my two choices of people in the ranks, and I felt it would be very wrong to write the book without giving some sense of what life was like in the ranks for people, because horrible as the war was, as the trenches were, as the life was, it was still dramatically better to be an officer than a soldier. The officers even had separate brothels with a blue light instead of a red light. So I mean, it was something that I felt if I didn't show, you would not have any real impression of what the war was like.
Well, they didn't have that on Upstairs, Downstairs. I can tell you that much. So the book, the book ends with sort of twinned stories. So a lot of these people are treated necessarily separately, but as it moves, as it were, towards its climax, you get the twined stories of Siegfried Sassoon and Wilfred Owen. And I just thought it would be, I thought it was an interesting way of sort of doing it because, of course, they are connected.
Yeah.
And it also occurred to me that there's something nice about, I mean, it's just the way that history arranged itself, that you end with these two figures, as you began by saying, there's something, you can't think of Wilfred Owen without your heart breaking because he almost makes it out of this horrible quagmire, and to die in the final week of the war is so terrible. And I think also hugely talented. One is really aware of a talent
Absolutely.
that could have become, it's heartbreaking to imagine. But very different to Sassoon. Sassoon, in his own life, it occurred. If this were fiction,
Yep.
you would have to sort of invent him to be the capstone of your book, because within the whole book, as we've said, charts the collapse of this civilization and the way that the war becomes unimaginably horrible. Everyone thought it was going to be over in 4 days. What was the field marshal whose plan? What was his name?
Lord French.
No. Already in the 1890s.
Oh, yes.
He had the plan, and it was all
Yeah.
going to be over in
Yes.
4 days.
4
We're going
days.
to go through Belgium, blah blah blah, but within Siegfried Sassoon's own life, he charts this sort of arc from the enthusiasm of Rupert Brooke to the total disillusionment of the later poets. And I just wanted to hear you talk a little bit about both of these remarkable figures and their connection.
Well, I think that's first of all, Sassoon is amazing because Sassoon actually met Brooke.
Yes, that's true. Right.
And they disliked each other. But the fact that of Sassoon's declaration against the war, which is still one of the most remarkable episodes in the First World War, is that Sassoon not only wrote a fluent and very hard-hitting declaration against the war and refused to serve in it at all, and threw the ribbon of his military cross into a canal and watched it sink. But that he was sent to Craig Lockhart, which was an old hydro that was turned into a place for officers who had had what was then described as shell shock or neuralgia. But in most cases, it was a moment of cowardice or fear. And they were sent there to be cured of that and then sent back to serve again once they were cured. That had not happened to Sassoon. Sassoon was incredibly brave, recklessly brave, never seems to have felt fear in any particular way, but came to the conclusion that the war was wrong, that it was being fought for the wrong reasons, that an end to it could have been negotiated and was not being negotiated, and simply stepped away from the war and wrote a public declaration against the war, which for a serving young officer was an amazingly courageous thing to do. He anticipated that he would probably be shot. And indeed, had he not been an officer, he probably would have been shot.
Yeah.
And his friendship with Owen is extraordinarily interesting. They were both what is now called gay, but that word was not used in that context at that period of time. But they clearly had a love affair of sorts together in Craig Lockhart. Owen had been sent there because his commanding officer, rightly or wrongly, thought that he had showed fear and that his nerve had broken. I doubt that that's true. I think there are many other reasons why his commanding officer felt that way. And he ended up with Craig Lockhart meeting Sassoon, and they had what could only be described as a rather discreet love affair in a place where that was exceedingly difficult to do. Because, and their feelings for each other, their letters to each other, are just extraordinary. I mean, Rupert Brooke himself was probably among the most prolific letter writers in the history of the fountain pen. It's just, you cannot even begin to imagine how somebody could do what Rupert Brooke did during his lifetime and have the time to write so many letters and at such length and so angrily and then post them instead of tearing them up. But Sassoon and Wilfred Owen come close. Their letters are incredibly readable, very frank, and in some cases heartbreaking. But it's a marvelous friendship, and it's I think one of the high points of the book is the relationship between the two of them.
Yeah, yeah. Also the subject of that marvelous trilogy by Pat Barker, the Regeneration trilogy. If you're not familiar with it, it's absolutely brilliant. And the psychiatrist who was responsible to cure them and send them back to the front. So I'm going to end because I know there are a lot of people who have questions, but I'm just personally curious. There's a phrase. Again, this is not a plug for the classics, but having just translated the Odyssey, I keep thinking of stock epithets. And there's a phrase that keeps recurring through the book. You often will end the description of a battle, this or that battle, with the phrase, for no significant gain of ground. It's a sort of a refrain that that knells through the book. And I'm just wondering, sort of more broadly, now that we are, you know, started writing this book, presumably, or at least thinking about it around the 100th anniversary of the end of the war, and now we have a century's perspective. And I'm just wondering what you think about the sort of popular perception of World War I. You know, once I think one crosses the century mark, things really begin to feel that they're in the rear view mirror in a certain way. And because you begin the book in such a moving way by describing how you grew up in a milieu that was so influenced and marked by it, I wonder, for example, I was very curious about what you thought of the recent remake of All Quiet on the Western Front, and just sort of generally what you think the chances of the First World War still having an impact through itself or through these poets, or are we looking at something that's really disappearing?
No, I frankly don't think it's disappearing. I actually quite liked the remake of All Quiet on the Western Front, and I thought it was well done, but probably a little cleaned up, and not necessarily as horrifying as the reality. There was also a very good, an extraordinary film in which the New Zealand director took the old footage from the Imperial War Museum, cleaned it up, and then colorized it, which normally I am entirely against because of my family, but was amazing. I mean, it was like looking at television footage shot of the First World War. And so, you know, I think there's enormous interest in the First World War. What is more, I think the phrase "no significant ground" is important because the great battles on the Western Front of the First World War were mostly fought despite incredible losses. I mean, the Battle of Verdun cost the lives of almost 1 million German and French. The First Battle of the Somme cost the lives of several 100,000 Englishmen and several 100,000 Germans, but for no significant gain of ground. At most, the front line advanced by 1 or 2 miles. There was never a breakthrough. And we see that being duplicated to some extent now, almost in a very frightening way in the war in the Ukraine, which has evolved after an initial Russian attempt to take Kiev with tanks, has evolved into a war of trenches, of dugouts, of artillery barrages, of mud, in which the gains are insignificant. You know, there's a huge battle being fought now in a Ukrainian village, the name of which I don't remember and probably wouldn't be able to pronounce, but of no complete importance. It cannot matter in the long run whether they take this village or don't take this village, and it doesn't stand for anything except what it is, which is by now a pile of ruins being fought over. So on a smaller scale, the futility of the First World War is being repeated today, and I find that very interesting. No significant gain of ground is exactly what defined the Western Front from 1914 to 1918, and I think it's clearly in a different form defining the war that's going on in the Ukraine now.
Well, I think your book will go a long distance and gain significant ground, if I may use that expression, and reawaken interest in this subject, and particularly these amazing figures whom you do the blessed deed of sort of reviving and bringing back to memory. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And I think it's time to turn over the floor to your admirers.
I will be very happy to be turned over to them, but thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Questions? Yes.
Were there
Gentlemen.
German poets or Russian poets who were equivalent, and just wondering if we know about them or how their views may have differed?
Well, that's a very trenchant question. Yes, the answer is yes. There are. I don't know that much about them. My German is not really good enough for me to do that. I know something about the French war poets, but not a lot. In the perfect world, I would have written a book about all the poets, including the Russian war poets.
That'll be your next book.
But I kept it to the English language ones. But yes, there's a lot of poetry. Whether it plays the same role in other countries as ours does, I don't know. I get the impression not. I mean, I just don't think that the Germans read Tonder's books of First World War German poetry. The French, yes, I mean, people do pay attention to them. The Russians, I have no idea, but most of our knowledge of Russian poetry post in the 20th century comes from the Russian poets under the communists. And a lot of that it sounds like First World War poetry, except it's not. So, but I think in England, the poetry mattered more than it did in other ways, and probably more than it did in other countries.
There was a German expressionist poet, Ernst Stadler, and what fascinates me about him is that he was a Rhodes Scholar between the years of 1905 and 1908, and in fact was going in 1914, in the autumn of that year, was going to Toronto to pick up to be a professor of English and English literature. And then the minute the war declared, he joined up immediately and was killed 6 weeks into the conflict. And what always strikes me is the incredible loss and the insanity of the war, and the fact that these people who had so much in common were fighting each other, and that he considered himself a European, but that patriotism and nationalism took over as soon as. And the only other thing I was going to mention, what's so fascinating to me about the relationship between Owen and Sassoon is the role that Sassoon played as editor of Owen's poetry. Yes. And you see that at the Bodleian in Oxford, and there actually are original documents. But the fact that Sassoon post-war never again wrote as he did during the war.
Well, never as well, certainly.
Right. Yeah. And what would have happened to Owen, one can only assume he would have gone on to bigger and better things.
I think so too. Yeah.
You couldn't fit everything in, and so poor Robert Graves is waiting for your next talk. But apart from his poetry,
no, I have Robert Graves.
Sorry, he does have Robert. I forgot.
Goodbye to All That must be the best piece of prose written by someone.
Yes,
on the Western Front. I think it's wonderful.
I think it's wonderful. But I think Sassoon's Memoirs of an Infantry Officer is also superb. And I am a great fan, and I'm not going to be devastating my age by not being able to remember his name now that I've said that he's great. But you will remember. Wrote a book called In Parenthesis.
David Shaw.
Who T.S. Eliot.
Yeah, wonderful.
And do you have a favourite poem?
Do I?
Do you have a favourite poem from the war poets?
Of the war poems, Yes, I think the attack by Siegfried Sassoon, the one that ends, "Oh Jesus, make it stop," is my favorite.
Yes.
I'd just like to put in a word for prose for the novel, four nights words parade in, which is a fantastic evocation of what it is like to be on the battlefield, and he does have important relationships with his enlisted men. Although he is an officer. It's a very, very great book, and
I'm sorry, I didn't understand that question.
Yeah.
couldn't hear the book.
It's a. Okay, we're going to do that one over.
Just going to put in a word for the novel, Formatic Sports, Parades End. Oh, Parades End.
Right.
Parades End, by Formatic Sports. Parades End.
She wants to put in a word for prose. A novel, Ford Ford.
Yeah, happy to allow formatted order, but I picked these six and they're ones I picked with, but it doesn't mean I'm excluding the other.
But what's interesting in Ford is he does talk about the communication between the officers and the enlisted men. He does some very remarkable things for the enlisted men, and he is fantastic about the boredom of the war, about the waiting, and how debilitating that is. And so I think not enough people read that book, so I wouldn't.
You're right, I'm sure.
It's interesting that one of the great, I'm coming back, Bob Klitzman, to your comment. So obviously, All Quiet on the Western Front is one of the great World War prose narratives, but I now feel like I want to chase down this business of who the German war poets were, because of course, and believe it or not, this is going to come back to the Iliad, but no, but it's quite interesting because the poetry of the defeated, I think, is going to be different in some way, you know, and what makes me think of that is that the aura, not of course at the time, say, I'm sure there are German poets writing poetry about how awful it is, just the way that these young men did, but the aura of tragic romance that attaches to these figures, which is why there is a thing called the World War I poets. They seem to represent something beyond the fact that they were poets and they were soldiers and all of that. Is a perquisite of the winner, I think, in a way that it cannot be for the loser. I'm sort of thinking out loud, but it makes, you know, you can have the Iliad because it's the Greek point of view about a war that they won, even though it was terrible for everyone involved. There is no Trojan Iliad, and I don't think there could be a Trojan Iliad in this funny way. So it's a very stimulating question.
Yeah, it is. I think that's extremely interesting, and I think you're right. There may be no significant German war poetry. There certainly is French, but then the French were winners.
Yeah. Other questions? Yes, in back.
You probably know or don't know this, but have you seen the films of the frozen body syndrome of the World War I?
Have we seen the films of the
frozen body syndrome?
The frozen body
They
syndrome?
were the results of the combat trauma in World War I. And it was so agitating on other people to see these people who talk sort of moved like robots. And as a Swiss citizen, Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, was sent to be the like the counselor for the Swiss prisoner of war camps of the English who had been traumatized in the war and then kept in German concentration camps. And they couldn't go back to England, so they were in Switzerland. And it was so agitating for Jung that he started making these mandalas just to protect himself, and that led him into the whole Eastern process of that mandala making. So it's quite an extraordinary thing to see these films, and they are available, you can see them online.
I'm not aware. I'm not aware of
I'm not
that.
sure I understand that.
It's,
That Vanderkolk, who wrote The Body Keeps the Score, watched those films, and that's what led him to this work. So I'm sorry I mixed that up a little bit.
no,
but-
that's all right, but Lynn?
Well, there's a film that you and I saw it on an airplane. But the Wilfred Owens and Sassoon that just came out in the last 2 years, it wasn't very good.
No,
Enemy's benediction.
Yes, was that the, yeah,
Yeah,
that's easily available, yeah.
Well, I do think, I mean, to my own point before about the popular culture, you know, there is a sort of romance.
Yes.
And we do get a lot of those sort of Merchant Ivory-esque kinds of movies. There is something about the period, partly, and this is what I was talking about before about the romance, because it is a war that broke European civilization in many ways, and so the sort of charm of pre-war Edwardian culture, you know, the about to go off the cliff.
Yeah.
It does still exert a hold on, I think, on imagination, both of people and of creative people.
absolutely. Going off the cliff is the perfect phrase for it. You are absolutely right.
And that's why it's interesting. Other questions from Michael?
Well, actually, no, I don't have a question. I just wanted to agree with you about what you said at the beginning. That you found it so strange that there were no heroic songs about the First World War. But people felt very happy about it and very proud. And I had two grandfathers, actually, I have to admit that I'm sort of in the same age group.
Right.
And these two grandfathers were both in the First World War. And they were terribly proud of the fact that each one had a saber scar on his cheek.
Yeah.
One was a minister and the other one was a judge. And the judge was a judge in Belgium for the army. And he was known as the Bon Juge because he allowed all the soldiers who tried to run away to be pardoned. And everybody thought that was very sweet, very nice. And no one took it very seriously. But then I do remember that when the Nazis came into power, my judge grandfather was sitting by the radio looking very, very concerned and serious. Something was no father, something to be proud of.
Michael, is there any evidence that the soldiers read the poetry as eagerly as the folks back home? Was it circulated up and down the trenches? Were they permitted to read such, seditious stuff?
Well, yeah, there wasn't any particular effort to stop them from reading anything they wanted to read, but I doubt that, I can only speak for England, that most British soldiers were poetry readers. But I think I think it's unlikely.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
So I just wanted to say, it's so interesting to talk about the British poets and the British tradition of poetry. And of course, you want to talk about the Iliad, which is a good segue because the Brits were trained as classical scholars. So from the very beginning, from the 15th century, they were reading the classics. And the classics are also referring to pre-literate societies in which the only way they could record history, their own history, was through sagas and songs and poetry.
Yes.
And the reason we have rhythm is so that everybody could remember who won that battle.
Right.
And all those poems were written about the victory. Nobody wrote about the battle they lost.
Right.
So it's a form of transferring history, and because the Brits were also trained in the classics, poetry became for them a part of the country that didn't really exist so to the same extent in other people's.
Yes, yes. Well, I think I mean, if I may, I think your point is, one could say that poetry begins with war. That poetry is the vehicle in almost every culture for conveying the great and glorious deeds of warriors. Gilgamesh,
Right.
Yeah.
the Iliad, so there is an association, and I think your point is extremely well taken, that particularly among the officer classes who Michael was referring to before, this stuff was burned into them from an early age, and it's why you can have someone like Rupert Brooke who absorbs this fantasy of glorious young death so wholly that it makes absolute sense to him in a way that we shake our heads and think this is total madness. And I do think even, so one of the interesting things seems to me about World War I, even though it is only 100 years ago, is one has to, and that's why I think your chapters on Brooke are so important, we, even though it happens all the time, we think of war as an aberration, as something that should not happen. And that is a fairly recent notion in the history of the species, right? That war is what you did. You planted your crops, certainly for the Greeks, you planted your crops, you went and made war on someone, and then if you were lucky, you came home. It was like going to summer camp. But it's very hard, but it's interesting because when, this idea of this sort of twining of war and poetry is very hard to teach to undergraduates who are horrified. Right. By everything, but, and they don't understand that there can be a glamour to war that these very intelligent people, like Rupert Brooke and some of these other people, bought into, that, so you have to sort of do a mental exercise.
Yes, but I think that's, people still bought into it during the Second World War. Unquestionably.
Yeah.
I think it's died down now. But you never know. It could come back at any moment.
Is there a final question maybe for Michael? Yes.
Just not a question as much as just putting in a plug, if you will, for women poets of the First World War. And someone has mentioned the home front, and certainly people like Vera Brittain in this country, Dorothy Parker, Sarah Teasdale. There's a wealth of poetry written by women who were equally, although very differently, obviously affected by the war. And I think I am so looking forward. I love the 6 poets that you're writing about. I can't wait to read the book. And I think to get a real full picture of the war, it's to bring in other voices as well.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.